Imagine waking up one morning, you rush to your local pharmacy only to find row after row of empty shelves. No insulin, no antibiotics, no cancer medications, just silence and a quiet panic rising inside you. It sounds like the plot of a dystopian novel, doesn't it? But this isn't fiction. This is a reality that could unfold faster than any of us expect. Because of choices made not yesterday, not last year, but decades ago. You see, over the course of many years, America built something extraordinary. A healthcare system that could save lives, extend hope, and defeat diseases once thought unstoppable. But hidden beneath that success story was a dangerous truth. We traded security for convenience. We outsourced the heartbeat of our healthcare, our critical drug supply, to a nation thousands of miles away. And now that nation, China, holds the power to turn off the tap. As tensions rise, as trade wars escalate, as political battles harden into economic warfare, the question becomes chillingly simple. What happens when the medicine runs out? Today, we're going to walk through the story behind this fragile dependency, how it began, why it was ignored, who benefited, and who warned us. And most importantly, what it means for you, for your family, and for the future of American healthcare. But before we dive deeper, let's step back for a moment, because to truly understand how we got here, we have to rewind the clock. Back to a time when decisions were made in quiet boardrooms, when profit margins whispered louder than warnings, and when the seeds of today's crisis were first quietly planted. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you looked at the label on your prescription bottle and wondered where it came from? Most of us never think twice. We trust that it'll be there, that someone somewhere is making sure the supply never runs dry. But the truth is, the backbone of American medicine isn't American anymore. It didn't happen overnight. Back in the 1980s and 90s, something began to shift. Globalization was the buzzword, and outsourcing, it was sold as efficiency. Cheaper labor, lower costs, higher profits. What could go wrong? Little by little, pharmaceutical companies started closing U.S. plants. Manufacturing was moved overseas, especially to China and India. Not just final products, but the very core, active pharmaceutical ingredients, or APIs. By the early 2000s, China was quietly becoming the world's pharmacy. And here's a number that still shocks me. Between 1990 and 20, the U.S. lost over 70% of its pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity. Gone. Factories shut down. Skilled jobs vanished. Entire supply chains handed off. Why? Because the system rewarded short-term gain. Wall Street applauded every penny saved. And honestly, most of us didn't notice. Not until now. Let me give you one quick example. Penicillin. The U.S. hasn't made a single gram of penicillin's key ingredient since 2004. China, on the other hand, became the global leader. So if tensions rise or trade routes close, we're left hoping the meds keep coming. Now, I want to pause here for a second, because it's easy to blame the system or big corporations. But this wasn't just about money. There was a quiet assumption behind all of it, that China would always play fair, that the global supply chain was too big to fail. And maybe we all got a little too comfortable. As someone who's seen friends struggle with getting life-saving meds, insulin, chemo, even simple antibiotics, this isn't just policy, it's personal. So here we are, a nation that once led the world in innovation, now standing in line dependent on another country for the most basic element of care, our medicine. And that leads to an even harder truth. What happens when that supply is turned into leverage? Let's talk about that, because China knows exactly how much power it holds, and it's already begun to use it. You know what's frustrating? This didn't just happen to us. It was engineered by the very companies we trusted to keep us healthy. While we were watching prescription prices rise, Big Pharma was laser-focused on something else entirely: profits over preparedness. Now, I'm not saying profit is bad. It keeps companies innovating. It rewards risk. But when life-saving medicine becomes just another line item on a balance sheet, something gets lost. Let me show you how deep this goes. In the mid-2000s, when a few lawmakers proposed tax incentives to bring pharmaceutical manufacturing back to the U.S., guess who fought it? Major pharmaceutical lobby groups. They argued it would raise costs, hurt competitiveness, and disrupt supply chains. And they had the money and the influence to make sure those bills never made it past committee. One case that still sticks with me is from 2011. A bipartisan bill aimed at securing domestic production of critical antibiotics died after a coordinated lobbying campaign. Publicly, the message was global efficiency, but behind closed doors, it was about preserving overseas contracts and protecting profit margins. Think about that for a second. Not only were these companies moving production offshore, they were actively working against policies that would have made the U.S. more self-reliant. Now here's the real ethical gut punch. Should life-saving medications, like insulin, cancer drugs, antibiotics, really be produced in countries where quality control, labor standards, and political stability are uncertain? Should your child's asthma inhaler be tied to a foreign supply chain? To me, that's not just a logistical issue, that's a moral one. And I get it, companies have shareholders. But we're not talking about toys or t-shirts here. We're talking about medicine. And I'll be honest, it feels like we've let the invisible hand of the market reach into our medicine cabinet and take too much. I think of my father, who relied on blood pressure meds every single day, and how even a 2-week delay would have sent us into a panic. That's not something a quarterly earnings report can capture. So what do we do with this knowledge? Well, first, we stop pretending this is just the way things are. It's not. These decisions were made by people. They can be unmade by people too. But to do that, we need to understand the full cost of chasing cheap pills. And it's not measured in dollars. It's measured in lives. And now that uncomfortable question becomes unavoidable. What happens when the country that makes our medicine decides to use it as a weapon? Let's look at the growing risks and China's strategic play in the next part. Here's something that might surprise you. Most Americans don't know what an API is, but without them, your pharmacy shelves would be bare. APIs, Active Pharmaceutical Ingredients, are the core building blocks of modern medicine. They're what make a pill actually work, beyond the fillers and coatings. And today, about 80% of the APIs used in U.S. medications come from one country, China. This didn't happen overnight. It happened over decades, through quiet shifts, silent shutdowns, and strategic positioning. Let's rewind the clock a bit. In the 1990s, as U.S. pharmaceutical companies raced to lower costs, China made an offer that was hard to refuse. Cheap labor, government subsidies, lax environmental and safety regulations. While American factories were closing under the weight of stricter standards and higher wages, Chinese manufacturers were ramping up, fast. By the early 2000s, China had already become a global hub for basic chemical production. And from there, it was only a matter of time before APIs followed. I remember reading about a U.S. antibiotics plant in New York that shut down in 2004. It was one of the last facilities in the country making penicillin APIs. Today, the entire U.S. supply of penicillin is dependent on Chinese sources. That's not just inconvenient, that's dangerous. It's the same story with chemotherapy drugs and insulin. For example, heparin, a common blood thinner used during surgeries and dialysis, 100% of its active ingredient is sourced from China. Let that sink in. If China stopped exporting just a handful of key APIs, millions of American lives could be put at risk in days, not weeks. And it's not a far-fetched scenario. In 2020, during the early stages of the pandemic, a spokesperson from China's Ministry of Commerce publicly hinted that they could withhold pharmaceutical exports as leverage. It wasn't a threat, but it was a reminder. Control isn't just about economics, it's about power. And as an American, that bothers me deeply. It's not about demonizing China, it's about recognizing where we stand and how fragile that position has become. We've essentially outsourced our pharmaceutical safety net and handed the scissors to someone else holding the thread. So the question becomes, if the United States can't make its own antibiotics, what happens in the next crisis? Let's explore that risk and what the future might look like in the next chapter. You'd think the world's richest country wouldn't struggle to stock basic medications, but walk into a rural hospital today and you might find something alarming. Empty shelves, delayed treatments, doctors forced to make heartbreaking choices. This isn't a hypothetical. It's a real-time crisis unfolding quietly across the U.S., especially in rural America. According to a 2023 survey from the American Society of Health System Pharmacists, over 90% of hospitals reported active drug shortages. That's not just niche medications either. We're talking about basic antibiotics, chemotherapy drugs, saline, and even children's painkillers. And here's the thing most people don't realize. Rural hospitals suffer first and suffer worst. Why? Because they already operate on razor-thin margins. They don't have the negotiating power of big city hospital systems. When a supplier can only ship to a limited number of locations, guess who gets bumped to the bottom of the list? A doctor I spoke with from rural Kansas told me, "We had to delay a cancer patient's treatment because we couldn't get a single dose of cisplatin for 2 weeks." 2 weeks. In cancer care, that can be the difference between remission and relapse. And the struggle isn't just with cancer drugs. Pediatric ICUs have had to ration Tylenol and ibuprofen during viral outbreaks. Hospitals are forced to substitute medications, or worse, send patients hours away to larger facilities that might have stock. It's easy to think of supply chains as abstract. Boats, warehouses, logistics. But for rural families, these shortages are felt in the most intimate way possible. In the ER, in a pharmacy line, at their child's bedside. And as someone who grew up in a small town, this hits home for me. I remember how far the nearest specialist was. Now imagine needing chemo and hearing, "We're out of stock." That's not just frustrating, that's terrifying. The deeper issue? These hospitals aren't just struggling with what's missing now, but what could be missing next. There's no buffer, no safety net, no room to maneuver when supply chains break. We're witnessing a slow-motion emergency, one that exposes how fragile and unequal our medical system really is. And that brings us to the core question. If we know the cracks are already showing, what happens when the next shockwave hits? In the next section, we'll dive into just that. How this pharmaceutical dependency poses a national security threat, and why the U.S. might be far less prepared than we think. What if I told you this crisis didn't sneak up on us? That long before shelves went empty, before rural hospitals sounded alarms, before COVID even entered the picture, experts had been warning us for years, and still, we hit snooze. This isn't just a supply chain issue, it's a case study in government inaction with strategic consequences. Let's rewind to 2005. That's when the U.S. Health and Human Services Department published a pandemic preparedness report. It flagged medical supply vulnerabilities as a top national security concern. It even listed active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, as a critical risk point. Then again in 2011, the Department of Defense warned that China's growing dominance in drug manufacturing could be used as leverage in future conflicts. By 2010, the FDA confirmed that 80% of the world's APIs came from abroad, a huge chunk from China and India. So we saw the risk, we had the data, and yet we didn't act. No emergency stockpile of essential drugs, no reshoring incentives for key medicines, no long-term plan for what would happen if or when those pipelines were disrupted. And then 2020 hit. COVID exposed it all. China locked down its factories. India halted exports. The US, scrambling to find ibuprofen, antibiotics, even sedatives for ventilated patients. It was like realizing your house had no fire extinguisher, while the kitchen was already burning. Now, I'm not saying we can anticipate every crisis, but what frustrates me, and I'm sure frustrates many of you, is how predictable this one was. This wasn't some obscure intelligence report buried in bureaucracy. This was clear public knowledge. So why didn't we act? Well, no. Some say politics. Others blame pharma lobbyists. But honestly, part of it might just be short-term thinking, kicking the can down the road until it lands squarely in our laps. And when national health security is treated like an afterthought, the consequences are real. Not just for rural hospitals, but for our military readiness, our emergency response, even our economy. Because how can we call ourselves self-reliant or secure when we can't produce life-saving medicine without foreign approval? That's a strategic weakness. Plain and simple. But here's the good news. Knowing where we failed is the first step toward fixing it. So in our final section, let's look ahead. What can be done now? What does a truly resilient pharmaceutical future for America look like? And how do we make sure we're never this vulnerable again? Let's talk solutions. What if America could turn this crisis into a comeback? What if the medicine shortage wasn't just a wake-up call, but a turning point? Because now that we've seen the cracks in the system, we finally have a chance to rebuild it, smarter, stronger, and together. Let's start with what's within our control. Rebuilding U.S. pharmaceutical manufacturing. This isn't about isolationism or cutting ties. It's about balance. Right now, America makes only a fraction of the drugs it consumes, and even less of the raw ingredients needed to produce them. So what can be done? Some smart proposals are already on the table. Congress has considered tax incentives for companies that bring drug manufacturing back home. Others is pushing for a Buy American mandate for federal drug purchases, starting with essential medicines for veterans and Medicare recipients. Then there's the idea of creating a national reserve of critical APIs, just like we have with oil. A stockpile that keeps our hospitals running, even if international trade halts again. And beyond policy, we need modern factories. Ones that use continuous manufacturing and automation to compete with low-cost countries. It's 25. We can build facilities that are faster, safer, and cleaner than ever before. But here's where I think we often forget something important. We don't have to do this alone. Countries like Japan, Germany, and Switzerland already have robust, transparent pharmaceutical industries. Instead of just trying to reshore everything, why not create a trusted pharmaceutical alliance? A group of democratic, high-standard nations that coordinate supply chains, that share production responsibilities, that support each other during crises like allies are supposed to. Think of it as NATO for medicine. And for anyone who says, that sounds expensive, let me ask, what did it cost us not to prepare? How many rural clinics closed early? How many patients suffered delays in care? How many millions did we spend chasing shipments at the last minute? Sometimes the cost of resilience is far lower than the cost of regret. Personally, I think this is about more than medicine. It's about national dignity, about telling future generations, yes, we faced a crisis, but we did something about it. So where do we go from here? That part is up to us. We can pressure our representatives to act. We can support policies that make long-term sense. And most of all, we can keep this conversation alive, because a secure, reliable health system isn't a luxury. It's a foundation. And like all foundations, it only holds if we choose to build it. So let's take a breath and look back at what we've just uncovered. America's growing medicine shortage isn't just about empty shelves. It's a deeper story about overdependence, missed warnings, and a system stretched too thin. We saw how rural hospitals were hit hardest, how government inaction turned small problems into national risks, and how inaction today could cost lives tomorrow. But we also explored a way forward, a roadmap to recovery, one that rebuilds pharmaceutical strength at home and unites us with allies who share our values, our urgency, and our vision. Because the next crisis, it won't send a warning. It won't wait for us to be ready. If we don't act now, even a simple antibiotic might be out of reach when we need it most. So what can we do? As citizens, we can talk about this. We can ask questions. We can hold our leaders accountable, and we can remind each other. Resilience isn't built in panic, it's built in preparation. If this video sparks something in you, if you believe we need a stronger, safer future, subscribe to stay part of this conversation. Share this with someone who cares, and comment below. What do you think America should do to fix this? Because change always starts with awareness, but it only becomes real when we act. Let's not wait for the next shortage to realize what matters most. Let's build something better, together.